On the 5th of January 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin preparing for the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation, reports on the Philippines, Malaya, and points south, indicated that Japanese troops in a few months would be in control of East Asia and the other areas they had attacked in December. So Yamamoto told his Chief of Staff, Matome Ugaki, that he wanted the plans to be completed by the middle of February. The speed with which the Japanese had conquered the Western Pacific astounded the planners in Tokyo and brought about sharp disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. The ardent military nationalists wanted to press on as long as Japan was victorious, no matter how far afield such planning led. Another group, represented by Admiral Yamamoto, had been less than enthusiastic about the opening of war with the United States and Britain and worried about the future. One reason Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato was that friends on the Imperial General Staff had worried that if he remained in Tokyo he would be assassinated because of his public opposition to unlimited war. Even now his opinions were no secret from those around him. His Chief of Staff, Admiral Ugaki, wrote in his diary about the need for far-sighted statesmanship following this first month of glorious victory. Those were words that Yamamoto often used in warning that Japan could not war on the Western powers and hoped to win in the long run. Yamamoto's open criticism of the politicians was aimed at Prince Konoye and others who did not seem to know what sort of war Japan should wage in the Pacific. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with a friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusue Dome organization at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto, warning his friend that war was inevitable because of decisions taken by the politicians, said that at first we'll have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. And now, just a month after the war had begun, the octopus was spread almost flat. Yamamoto, however, had also warned his old friend that the euphoria could not last. The time, he said, for political action was the moment that Singapore fell. That disaster would unsettle the British in India, and they would undoubtedly be willing to listen to talk of peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had been a member of the delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans, and he had been Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1908. He agreed that once war was started by the politicians, a major victory must be won quickly. But when that victory was achieved, he believed Japan would have only a year and a half to bask in glory. "We must get a peace agreement by then," he told Sasakawa, and he looked to this old friend to carry the word among the right-wing political leaders who were in power. On January 5, the victory seemed close at hand. The American battleship fleet had been put out of action at Pearl Harbor on December 7. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off the Malay coast. In the Philippines, Manila and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered at Hong Kong, and Japanese forces were on their way to new landings in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul, on New Ireland, Amboina, and in the Solomon Islands. The attack at Pearl Harbor, however, had not accomplished all Yamamoto had hoped for, the destruction of the major elements of the United States fleet. The aircraft carriers which had been at sea were unharmed and represented a constant threat. What was needed was a spectacular achievement, and Yamamoto did not expect the fall of Singapore for 5 or 6 months. It came on February 15. He believed that if he was to achieve his goal of setting up the stage for negotiation, he must move in another direction. But the question before his planners was where to strike next. The army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the army was heavily occupied in China and Southeast Asia, so 3 other ideas were offered. Yamamoto's favourite was to attack in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet and destroy it as Yamamoto had destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor, and then push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans, who were driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Thus, the Japanese Navy would be assured of all the oil it needed. The army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation, so only 2 plans were left. 1. advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of that forward base of operations. After moving into the Solomon Islands, the Navy would take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Advocates of this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already setting up occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand, but Yamamoto did not like the Australia plan because he thought it would take too long and still would not be spectacular enough to halt the Americans. Yamamoto also knew the Pearl Harbor attack had aroused the spirit of vengeance in people the Japanese had been learning to detest as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the army said, to fight a war to the finish. It was apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a victory that would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January, Yamamoto ordered another plan drawn, and 2 months later sent officers to Tokyo with the document, designated the MI Plan, which envisaged a battle off Midway Island, where the American carrier force would be destroyed. He also sent to Tokyo the AL Plan, which detailed the invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, Hawaii would be occupied, and later perhaps the West Coast. At least victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give the politicians a base for negotiating the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve. In Tokyo, the admirals quarreled around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but in the end, Yamamoto had his way. Forgotten was the potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February, and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purpose. The reason they were no longer important lay in the April raid of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doolittle raid had shocked the Japanese into a realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight. In June, after the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, there was no time for recrimination. Indeed, the army did not even know the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 big fleet carriers was carefully suppressed, so that it was known only at the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward to set up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australia. Naval forces had taken Rabaul on January 23, and from that time onward they had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It was apparent to the Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. If they were successful, it would be very nearly a walkover for the Japanese to take northern Australia. In February, the Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Salamaua, New Guinea, the pace stepped up. In May, just before the Midway battle, the Japanese sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back by the fierce defense of the Americans and Australians in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and built a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for a Japanese move in the south. MacArthur told the Australian government it must be ready for an attack before a Japanese thrust that was generally expected to be made against India. He cabled General Marshall for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes, but in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until the end of June he would have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific, while, on the eve of Midway, the Japanese had 10. And Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already given advance warning about the big move he expected the Japanese to make, which turned out to be the Midway battle. While events were taking their course at Midway, the Japanese were establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tomitaro Horii landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, and the naval troops occupied Lae and began to build up an air base there. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyukatake was ordered to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. That would be after the Midway battle, when Admiral Yamamoto could be expected to have returned with his combined fleet. That big carrier force was expected to protect this new move. In spite of the defeat at Midway, which was reported as a victory to the forces in the field, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans. A few days after Midway, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were ready to move. In view of the Midway victory, MacArthur suggested that the Allies make a preemptive attack on the New Britain-New Ireland area, and then an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the area. With the 2 carriers and the 1,000 planes and an amphibious division, MacArthur would force the Japanese back to Truk. On June 12, General Marshall offered the MacArthur plan to Admiral King with some modification. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, and 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to make the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea, because it would put MacArthur in command of the fighting. King's other reasons were supplementary. The carriers would be subject to land-based attack, and they would not have enough protection. As it turned out, the Navy had to cope with both of these tactical problems at Guadalcanal. King devised his own plan, a drive from the New Hebrides by forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to having his army forces serve under the Navy, but nobody could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they took New Guinea and were poised to attack Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who was going to command the operation. They gave Phase 1 the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was just a spot on the map with no known tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a name in this JCS plan. General MacArthur was thrown a SOP. After Phase 1, he was to take over and mop up the Japanese in the rest of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King was given his way because the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that King had already planned a defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan would need relatively less force than MacArthur's. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had wheedled General Arnold into sending several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had reinforced Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides, and he planned to put a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness at the time of the Wake Island crisis had aroused King's annoyance, was shipped off to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command. At San Diego, he and Marine Major General Holland Smith were told to develop new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the first effort must be to hold the line in the South Pacific, while training the amphibious forces. The second stage would be a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, through the Solomon Islands, to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth stage would take the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was just what he himself envisioned, and he made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and told him to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious operation. All this was done even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1. He would take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19, but first he had to go to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley got to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already beginning in the South Pacific. On May 22, an Army plane saw a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that the grass on the island's central plain had been burned off, and tents had gone up in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that construction of an airfield was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew the names: the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were the equivalent of American CB units. This information was confirmed in a radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence group, which had broken parts of the Japanese naval code, picked up a message saying that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4, and Fleet intelligence put 2 and 2 together. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day on his way to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner knew where he was going. It could be no place but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His task was to train a whole amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began to move ships and men around, Admiral Gormley was on his way to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy thoughts about the foolishness of trying to stage an amphibious operation when no one knew how to do it. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, agreed with him entirely. They also agreed that with the planes at hand, they could not guarantee the landings sufficient air coverage. After all, this meeting occurred on July 18, and the landings were to be made in 3 weeks. They sent a dispatch back to Washington, recommending that the operation be deferred, but King was not happy with that message. King had told his new commander that he was handing him a difficult job, and that he would not be able to give him the proper tools until perhaps the fall. The answer was no, the invasion would proceed as planned. Now Gormley had left Washington convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom increased when he tried and failed to get Seabees and other units sent immediately to New Zealand. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was notable for failures of intelligence. All concerned commands knew that an operation was in the offing, particularly after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his operations orders. The major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt that they could strike a deadly blow at the Allied build-up. But on July 10, the Allied Intelligence Service's report reaching King contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield, and back at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission would leave Rabaul on August 14. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley tried desperately to get more help, to build advance bases, to bring in more planes. But everywhere he turned, he learned the truth of Admiral King's assertion that he would not be able to provide Gormley with proper tools. The supplies of the invasion forces, for example, were loaded hodgepodge aboard the transports. At Auckland there were plenty of docks, so that the ships could have been unloaded and reloaded with supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Noumea, which had no such facilities, and Admiral King had at least a general idea of the difficulties, but there was not time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they got to Australia. The timetable remained. By late July, the rush was on, and 17,000 Marines were moving by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too busy to hold a conference of his commanders, but on July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was supposed to be in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders met to talk about the invasion, and Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandergrift. Once the Marines had taken the island, garrison troops would be brought in, but so hastily was this operation called that no one had made provision for any troops to be held in reserve. There were no more men available in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was not a happy one. Fletcher began by announcing that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff members at the meeting concurred, that the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher was gun-shy because he had lost the Lexington at Coral Sea and the Yorktown at Midway. His thinking went no further than that. In fact, Fletcher said at the meeting that the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who had a better idea of the global military picture than any other man in the cabin that day, chided his superior. There was no point in that sort of argument, he said, and the decision had been made to risk all. It was their job to carry out orders. Fletcher ought to have known all that. After Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of action that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz ascertain the condition of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz was a kindly man, and he liked Fletcher. He had given the carrier commander a pep talk, and then, when the Battle of Midway was won, Fletcher, who was in command there, could hardly be faulted. But on the eve of the first American offensive operation, to warn the troops and the men of the support ships that he was going to desert them in 48 hours was a most inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was staged on July 28 and lasted 3 days. The scene was Coro Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they didn't know what to do. General Vandergrift regarded the mock-up as a complete bust, but there was no time even to second-guess. On July 31, the Marines were back aboard the transports, heading for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers. He would have his planes over the landing force as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were being taken as far from harm's way as possible. If American intelligence was so faulty as to permit the Japanese build-up of the airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was faultier, for as the United States invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no inkling of a forthcoming attack. In July 1942, the Japanese army was preoccupied with trying to capture New Guinea as a staging point for its operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Horii's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buna. After capturing Buna, the Japanese planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby. So in July, Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters swept over the piers and airfields nearly every day. After the Japanese landings, the Japanese AI forces were also called on to support the beachhead, and in the early days of August, their attention was fixed on the new drive. The combined Australian and American Air Force responded with raids on the Japanese air bases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. In a leisurely fashion, he was preparing for the forthcoming air operations over Australia, and he would see then what action was to be taken next. In preparation, on August 3, the naval air groups stationed at Lae were brought back to Rabaul to be ready for the Guadalcanal operations that would begin the following week. During the first week of August, the South Pacific skies were cloudy, and only a handful of Japanese search planes took to the skies. None of them found the American armada that was steaming toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buna. They had been told that the United States carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed that the carriers were operating with Australian forces that had marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains. Actually, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected a forthcoming invasion. After their 8 months of continuous victories, it was hard for the Japanese to believe that the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion. Had the idea been suggested, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an invasion had almost no chance of success. So as the American expeditionary force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed the element of surprise. On August 4 and 5, the 75 ships steamed on under an overcast sky, and on August 6 the fleet moved through rain squalls almost all day long. But as dawn rose on the morning of August 7, the sky cleared, which meant the carrier planes would have good visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30, and at 6 o'clock the carriers launched their first strike. The planes from the Wasp, Saratoga and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal Island, Tulagi, Gavutu and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were connected by a causeway. The Japanese planes had been kept down the day before by bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, but whether it was Japanese or a plane from General MacArthur's command was undetermined. In any event, the Japanese were not aroused until 6:12 a.m. when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message went to the 4th, 6th and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and Imperial Headquarters. It was simple and succinct. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress, the weather had cleared, and the carrier planes flew off into scattered cumulus clouds in the light of a quarter moon. The fighters and bombers moved off on their appointed missions. 8 fighters, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer, took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft and no PT boats, and they did strafe the buildings on the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol over the transports from 6 until 8 o'clock, when they were replaced by others. Bombers began to hit Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was seen all morning. The Americans had it all to themselves, and the only planes damaged were those hurt in operational accidents. Planes from the other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu. The surprise was complete. The American planes arrived and began bombing and strafing the seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that doubled as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots who tried to take off were shot down before they were airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the attack. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck targets on the beaches that the Marines would soon invade. Before dawn, the Marines on the decks of the transports could see the high mountains of the island that was their objective. The transports slipped through the narrow neck that runs between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sea Lark Channel. As dawn rose, the guns of the escorting warships fired, and flashes of light illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no answering fire. The bombardment from the cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troopships started fires along the shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping into the sky. At 8 o'clock, after 2 hours of bombing and shelling of the island, the landing craft began to move toward the north shore east of Lunga Point. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had any practical experience in such a landing, for this was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 o'clock, troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because the Japanese had fled into the hills. The going was ridiculously easy. The Marines soon saw how completely they had surprised the enemy. They came across wooden barracks that had never been slept in. They found a tent with a breakfast table full of platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. There were half-filled rice bowls scattered around, chopsticks hastily dropped on the table or on the straw mats of the floor. The tents themselves told why the Japanese had left so rapidly. They were torn by shrapnel, and some were knocked flat by the shelling of the naval vessels before the landing. But any Marine who felt like celebrating over the ease with which they had taken their early objectives had some shocks coming. It was true that the Japanese had been surprised on Guadalcanal, and they had not dug in yet, nor created permanent fortifications, because most of the men were construction troops, not fighting men. But over on Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines had encountered stout resistance. About 250 Japanese were located on this island. The Japanese were troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Hasike Miyazaki. They were experienced and dedicated fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers, chosen from the ranks of a force known for its fighting qualities. The Raider concept had come from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for creation of a commando force, and Carlson's experience had included a service tour of several months with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's raiders had trained for many months under Spartan conditions, and when they came to Guadalcanal, they already had a powerful reputation. As it turned out, they would need every trick they had learned and would learn some new ones. This invasion was the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war had begun in December. The Japanese had a reputation even more fearsome than that of the Raider battalions, gained through the phenomenally rapid march of their forces through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had crowed over its victories, and half the world had come to believe the Japanese were invincible, a reputation the Imperial High Command was pleased to encourage. Tulagi, then, was in a sense the first testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern part of the island, and at the beginning the going did not seem much harder than it was on Guadalcanal. They encountered some resistance from a few outposts. The northwest part of Tulagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea, with its beautiful leaves and sharp thorns. At first, the terrain seemed to be the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man, and that one to a sniper as the Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge that ran the length of the island, and then work along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes as they moved south. But the terrain was so difficult that it took 3 hours for the men to chop their way along 1.5 miles of rising ground. Having reached the ridge line, the Marines moved ahead, came out of the jungle, and ran straight into the central Japanese defences, built on the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock embrasures, and had placed their machine guns carefully to create interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defence was based on keeping the enemy below them, but the Marines found that by crawling up the cliffs they could drop charges of dynamite and grenades into the dugouts, and that was the method they had to use to advance. Once a dugout was blown, it still was not safe. In one hole, the Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. One Marine spotted a radio inside and went in to retrieve it. There were still 2 Japanese soldiers alive, and they shot him and another man who came after him before they were killed. One section of Marines took on this defence position in the centre of the island, while the centre and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. But even along the ridge line the going was not easy. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. The frontal resistance was stiff, but with the Japanese, frontal resistance was only half the battle. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied in trees, in the tops of buildings, behind rocks. A favourite tactic of the snipers was to let the forward element of a Marine unit pass, and then begin shooting at the men from behind. This move almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he had caused several casualties. And one thing the first raiders learned that day was that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slug were more apt to wound than to kill, which from the Japanese point of view was satisfactory, since it took additional troops and resources to care for the wounded. During the afternoon, the raiders drove along the ridge until they ran into a 3-sided ravine, whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls and established the fields of fire that would become so familiar in later months. As the Marines moved up, they ran into crossfire, and Edson stopped because darkness was coming, and this was no time to be probing known dangers. That night, the Marines on Tulagi had another new experience. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered with no chance of survival, staged one of the desperate counterattacks for which they would become infamous. They waited until the Marine perimeter was quiet. Then at 10:30 a.m. they broke through between 2 companies and surrounded one of them. The Marines fought in their foxholes and in the open, using guns, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese came along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post and reached a point 50 yards from him. Finally, the Marines overpowered the Japanese and threw them back, but not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8, more troops were landed on Tulagi, until there were 7,500 on that side of Sealark Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines began moving again toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one they attacked the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one cave they removed 35 dead Japanese, some of them already rotting and stinking, but some killed in the last moment of defense of the position. From this, the Americans deduced properly that the Japanese tactic was to hold a position until the last unless ordered to retreat, proof of the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were mostly members of labor battalions, not combat troops. The raiders that second day encountered dozens of examples of a spirit they had not seen before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers, who at the end had only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines were ready to make the final assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered the dugout, they discovered 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself. In those first days, this suicidal attitude surprised the Marines. It was hard for an American to understand how cornered or wounded men with no hope of survival in their hole, knowing that the enemy had an enormous material and numerical advantage, would almost invariably choose death to surrender. It took some getting used to, but after a few Japanese had pretended to surrender, only to pull out guns or bayonets to attack their captors, or to explode grenades to kill themselves and their enemies, the Marines took the Japanese on their own terms. Thereafter, there was virtually no further attempt to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was brought under control on that second day, although not all the Japanese on the island had been killed. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed the American troops, until the last sniper was killed. One gets a feel for the stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi in the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He had gone ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field. The Japanese had fired sporadically from that position. He moved up close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave, and the Marines had been trained to pull the ring pin of the egg-shaped grenade, throw, count slowly, and hear the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, threw, and counted. On 6, the grenade was lobbed back out of the cave, and he had to duck to escape the blast of his own weapon. After another identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw 4, 5, 6, and out it came again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite, usually used to blow buildings. He thrust in the charge, primed it, and ran back a little. The Japanese thrust the charge out of the mouth of the cave. The dynamite exploded and drove a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound was not serious enough to fell him, but it hurt enough to infuriate him. He picked up his submachine gun and dashed into the cave, spraying fire. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who had died earlier. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was worse than that on Tulagi. The landings there came in the middle of the morning. Not many troops were committed, because no one expected to find many Japanese there. But since the seaplane base was on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them, and the Marines ran into trouble. The Japanese were surprised and had still not recovered from the bombardment and aerial attack that had destroyed their seaplanes, so the first troops ashore were met by rifle fire only. But when the second wave of Marines reached the beach, the Japanese had organized about 500 yards back, and the fire was intense. The third wave came under fire before the landing craft reached shore, and the casualties were heavy. Gavutu and Tanambogo were both dominated by small hills, not quite 150 feet high, but above the sea-level landings. This height was enough. The Japanese had built their defences along the slopes, and they were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be taken. They did not retreat, and the viciousness of the fighting on Tanambogo was almost unbelievable. In the early waves, the Marines had landed tanks. The Japanese had come surging toward the Tanambogo dock, where the landings had been made. They had jammed crowbars under the treads, thrown grenades, and tried to set the tanks afire with rags soaked in gasoline. One tank commander had opened the hatch and employed the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers, before one scram bled up the side of the tank and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, and it burned. By mid-afternoon on this first day, it was apparent that the Marines could use reinforcements, and a unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where there were no Japanese, was called over to assist. Tanambogo had been taken, but the Marines were unable to secure the causeway that linked the 2 small islands. The reinforcements were ordered to Tanambogo, and at dusk were given 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unluckily, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach and lit up the shore as if it were noon. As the Marines came up, the Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the sea. From the dugouts on the hills came a steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire. 2 boatloads of Marines reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller, and the boat slewed around and headed back out to sea. The following boats did the same, believing there had been some change in orders, so the men of the 2 boats were stranded ashore, and their only protection was the concrete pier. The Japanese were firing. As soon as the Americans returned the fire, the Japanese spotted the position by the tracers, Soon several men were down. One boat retired, taking the wounded, and it was some time before the confusion was eliminated and other boats began to land. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the leader of the unit, was cut off from his boat, and he and 5 men hid in the brush, and in the darkness they escaped to return to the beach after the Japanese had drawn back to their hillside positions. Eventually they were extricated, but it was 4 o'clock on the morning of August 8 before another unit landed and was able to secure the causeway. When the fighting started, there were 500 Japanese on the connecting islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. When the fighting ended, there were none. Early on the morning of August 7, the Tulagi radio station flashed the first word of the United States assault to Rabaul. The astounding news reached the Rabaul airfield just as the pilots of the early morning missions were preparing to take off for another day's harassment of the Australians on New Guinea. The orders were immediately cancelled, and all available planes were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Before the planes could take off, they received the unwelcome news from Tulagi that the entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Then contact with Tulagi was broken, which could only mean that the base there had been overrun. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded for the strike against Australian forces on New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. 18 Zero fighters accompanied them as they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Buka Island and turned south along the Bougainville coast. They were picked up by 4 Enterprise planes just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet, when down below they spotted the large formation of Betty bombers, escorted by the Zeros, just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked, and Lieutenant V.P. Dupois shot down 1 bomber. 4 others began to smoke and were listed as probables. But after this initial run, the Zeros joined the fight, and the F-4Fs broke off to take refuge in cloud cover, as they had been instructed to do. They had been hard hit. One of the F-4Fs had been shot down, and Lieutenant Dupois' plane was so badly shot up he had to make an emergency landing on the Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Fireball led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, and they found the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. The Zeros came in fast, 10 of them, and attacked 3 of the fighters. All 3 F-4Fs were shot down. The other 3 American fighters attacked the bombers, and Ensign R.N. Diskay shot down 1 Betty. The first kill of a Zero was made by radio electrician T.W. Rhodes, but the Zeros came after them in force, and the F-4Fs ducked into clouds to hide. There were 10 Zeros after them in 2 formations, and they came in, observing the Japanese rule: never let your wingman out of sight. They attacked the F-4Fs from the starboard quarter, and Lieutenant Fireball and enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson Jr. and pilot machinist W.H. Warden were shot down. One of the coast watchers picked up Fireball from the water off Santa Isabel Island. A Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden off that same island, but Stevenson was not found. Aboard the other carriers, the story was much the same. The bombers were much easier targets. 6 fighters of Flight 323 ran into enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist D.E. Runyon destroyed 2 single-handedly, just after 2:30 a.m. in the afternoon. When the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their run over the islands, coast watchers were on the alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copra planter in peacetime, was stationed on Malabita Hill on Bougainville, overlooking Buin. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he sent a message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles, or 2¼ hours away from the target, when that message was broadcast back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. That message reached the invasion fleet in plenty of time for preparations. The reaction of HMAS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers, was typical. When the word came, the boatswain's mate piped the message: "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 o'clock, and the torpedo bombers came in right on schedule. The United States fighters climbed above them to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal and looked down on the invasion fleet at noon. The American carrier fighters and the guns of the ships were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were feeling the results of counterattack. the American fighter planes were quite effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal, all but one were shot down, and the only damage sustained in that first attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which was hit by a bomb. Against the Zero fighters, however, it was a different story. Pilot officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among those 18 chosen for their skill to make this first long-range mission. Over the target, the Japanese force was jumped by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers, and they went in straight for the bombers, ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros protected the bombers as well as they could, but then turned to the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. The Navy pilots dived against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. They had been instructed well by their intelligence officers, who knew that the Zero was superior in turning and climbing ability, as well as faster. After a grim and skillful battle, Sakai shot down one F-4F and an SBD dive bomber that by itself jumped 4 Zeros. Several other Japanese pilots made kills. While 1 Zero was lost, pilot Sakai attacked a group of the SBD torpedo bombers, thinking they were fighters, and ran straight into 4 spitting machine guns manned by rear gunners who had him cold as he came in. His Zero was badly smashed and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul and land it before collapsing. In the air, the Japanese still had a temporary advantage in the quality of the Zero, but already the Americans in their F-4Fs were beginning to learn to use the limitations of the enemy to their advantage. The matter of control of the air was obviously going to be hotly contested. At this particular moment, the Americans had the advantage of propinquity with the carriers close offshore, but the Japanese had the advantage of numbers at Rabaul, and the American effort was seriously hampered by the superiority of the Japanese Zeros over the American fighters. The carrier pilots were flying the F-4F Wildcat, which was not as fast or as maneuverable as the Zero, and the Japanese could fly rings around them. The one advantage of the F-4F was its sturdy construction and armor protection, all that was needed to keep the ratio of lost planes as low as it was for the Americans. At Rabaul, the Japanese recovered rapidly from the surprise of the American invasion, but the problem for the Japanese fighters was the 1,100-mile round trip. For that reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, the leader of the fighter squadron, had resisted demands by higher authority that all Zeros available be sent into the fight, and had dispatched only his most experienced flyers. He was soon to be sending others, and the losses grew more serious, largely because of the vast distances to be traversed. By nightfall of the first day, the United States invasion seemed secure. The American troops had moved up near the airfield and had not encountered any substantial resistance. One prisoner was captured, and he indicated that there were only about 600 combat troops on the island and 1,400 labourers, and that they had fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had moved 11,000 Marines ashore, and vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowded the beaches. General Vandergrift had noticed that the beach force was unable to assimilate the supplies, but fearing that the carriers would soon move out, he was glad to see the supplies still coming in. He did establish a second beachhead, but it was soon crowded as badly as the first. At 8:40 a.m. on the morning of August 8, Coast Watcher Jack Red at Buka Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kavieng. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor repeated the broadcast to the ships. The carrier planes attacked and destroyed many of the enemy bombers, but on this day the United States ships did not escape unscathed. A blazing bomber dived into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott and set it afire. One dive bomber sent a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, the planes of the Enterprise and the other carriers took off on their missions and found the skies clear. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tenarue River, and they worked over the airfield again. At about 10 o'clock, 3 fighters from the Enterprise discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low over the surface of the water to attack the transports. The Americans jumped them. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter, Ensign V.H. Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another. That was the end of the air activity for the day. At nightfall, the Enterprise's Fighting Six counted its losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese Zero fighters still had the edge in experience and aircraft, but the American pilots were already beginning to learn tricks of the trade. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group concluded that the Zero had 2 major weaknesses: limited firepower and inability to withstand punishment. Because of the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, the F-4F pilots were warned to stick close together, and when attacked, each 2-plane element should set up a scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other. Thus, the pair of F-4Fs could concentrate their superior firepower on the enemy, while they knew their own planes could absorb an enormous amount of punishment. On the ground, the Marines fought fierce Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties, but took control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of 250 men fought to the end. 200 men were killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swam the strait to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Marines suffered 250 casualties. The 500-man Japanese garrison was wiped out to the last man. The fierceness of this fighting on Tulagi was in sharp contrast with the easy advance of the Marines on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8, the Marines reached the edge of the airport they would name Henderson Field. After a flyer killed at Midway, they were beginning to develop a contempt for the enemy. "I wish those fucking Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine said within the hearing of Richard Tregaskis, the International News Service correspondent who had accompanied the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle. On the surface, then, the Marines couldn't ask for a finer war, but the officers were edgy that second afternoon. It was too easy." At sea, the Americans apparently had no opposition either. A few Japanese patrol craft and tenders and 1 or 2 transports had been caught off the shore, and they had been destroyed in the first hours of the invasion by shelling and bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans pause. Most of those first waves of bombers were destroyed, but the cost of meeting the Zeros was 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. That loss, not high by operational standards, convinced Fletcher that his decision to withdraw was sound. At 6 o'clock that evening, Fletcher asked Admiral Gormley to allow him to withdraw his carriers. He withdrew before he had a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized that the carrier withdrawal would leave him without any air cover. The number of Japanese planes could be expected to increase sharply as the enemy brought down more aircraft through the island chain. As Fletcher began to withdraw, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word invasion had been flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had reacted immediately. Admiral Mikawa was commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, which meant he had the responsibility for the whole South Pacific operation. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and dispatch them with destroyer escort to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. But the convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, which was operating out of Australia following the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 sank the transport Meio Maru with 342 men aboard. The sinking, coupled with the reports of the enormous American invasion flotilla, persuaded the admiral that it was too dangerous at the moment to try to reinforce the garrison, and he called back the other 5 transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already on the way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa had been lucky in the matter of timing. Early on the morning of August 7, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers left Cavien on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 of them were headed northeast for Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbour. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin. When she came up late that afternoon, she was carrying Admiral Mikawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. So the Japanese moved toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Mikawa composed his battle plan. By cutting speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8, and make a surprise night attack on the American forces at the beachhead. The admiral knew that the Americans had several carriers in that area, while he had none. A night attack was a guarantee that he would not be harassed by American planes, since the Americans had no record of proficiency in night aerial operations. In fact, the Americans had no record of competence in any sort of night naval operations, while this aspect of tactics had become a Japanese specialty. Mikawa's problem that afternoon was how to move close to Guadalcanal without coming in too soon, and still not give away the element of surprise. He had to attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders, but if he could surprise the enemy, the effectiveness would be enormous. The admiral did not know it just then, but the nature of the divided command, the inferiority of the American air intelligence system, and the lack of clearly defined search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence about Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to depend on air search and submarine reports. Only under the most special circumstances would the reports of coast watchers be of much use concerning naval ship operations. Early in the day, the cruisers were sighted by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved down toward Rabaul. On the evening of August 7, the Mikawa force was sighted by the S-38 just as it came out of St. George's Channel. That night, the commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane, but those two reports were not given much credence by American naval commanders, because Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's forward base, and it was quite normal for ships to move in and out. The Americans saw no indication that the ships in question were steaming toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for the coordination of all elements of the American attack, but to secure air searches, he had to depend on several sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included a number of seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were to take responsibility for the search of the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the big naval and air base at Rabaul. McCain was to watch the northern approaches to the region, which meant Truk and the Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to make short-range searches, but actually made none at all. Fletcher was bemused with his worries. Admiral Turner had looked at his charts and seen that the Japanese had a marvelous approach to the island of Guadalcanal along the west coast of Bougainville. Straight down between Choiseul Island and Vella La Vella, past Colombangara, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. The lane was christened the Slot. Soon it was to become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly from Nandi on a 700-mile-long triangular pattern whose apex was the Fiji Islands. They would come up almost due west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo, northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands, and end at a point slightly above the Bismarcks, but far to the west of the Japanese task force. 6 PBYs would spread out from Malaita across the Slot from Guadalcanal to search an area north and west of the Slot. 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal on the night of August 7. When Admiral Turner studied the search plan for the following day, he found the Slot was completely uncovered. He asked Admiral McCain for a special search there the next day, but somehow, between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Malaita, the message was lost. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8, the Americans had left uncovered the most obvious approach of any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal.